My name is Rivka Odom Shalai. 31 days ago, a surgeon in Tel Aviv cracked my sternum open and my heart stopped for 9 minutes and 40 seconds. What happened during those 9 minutes and 40 seconds has cost me everything I once considered permanent. My standing in my community, my scholarly reputation, my marriage of 19 years, the warmth in my mother's eyes when she looks at me. I am writing this from a rented room in Netanya because I no longer have access to the home I built. I am not asking for your sympathy. I am asking for your attention. What I encountered on the other side of that threshold left me with 3 specific warnings about events scheduled to occur in April 2026. Not feelings. Not impressions filtered through grief or longing, coordinates, dates, mechanisms. If those 3 events unfold as I was shown them, and they will, then the architecture of everything you believe about God, about history, about the nature of reality itself will require immediate and radical revision. I was raised in a household where intellectual rigor and religious observance functioned as a single, unified enterprise. My father, Zevulun, was a professor of ancient Semitic languages at Hebrew University, a man who believed that Torah study was the highest form of human activity, and who treated casual theological claims with a contempt so refined it barely needed expression. My mother, Adassa, ran a ceramic studio in Jerusalem's German colony neighborhood and attended synagogue not out of obligation, but out of what I can only describe as genuine appetite. She loved God the way certain people love the sea, with full awareness of its indifference to their admiration and without requiring reciprocation. I followed the academic path, a doctorate in Second Temple historiography, a position at a research institute in Jerusalem, studying the political and social context of Jewish messianic movements in the first century. My entire professional life was devoted to understanding the historical landscape from which Christianity emerged, which meant I spent 20 years developing an elaborate and rigorously sourced understanding of why the claims made about Yeshua of Nazareth were theologically irreconcilable with Jewish messianic criteria, historically unsupported, and spiritually incoherent. I was not hostile to Christians. I was professionally interested in the phenomenon and personally certain of its foundational error. My husband, Pinchas, taught mathematics at a secondary school in Beit HaKerem. We had 2 daughters, Sipora, 16, and Margalit, 11. We observed Shabbat. We fasted on Yom Kippur. We built a sukkah in the garden every autumn. We were, I believed, and I still believe this was not entirely delusion, genuinely happy. The heart condition had announced itself quietly, the way serious things often do. Intermittent pressure behind the sternum, which I attributed to stress. A cardiologist in August 2025 identified a defect in the mitral valve, congenital, dormant for decades, now demanding attention. Surgery was recommended before the end of winter. I scheduled it, told Pinchas it was routine, told my daughters it was the kind of thing doctors fix every day, told my mother not to come down from Jerusalem. On February 4th, 2026, they placed me under general anesthesia at Ichilov Hospital. I reached the number 7 on the countdown, and then I was somewhere else entirely. I need to be meticulous here because I understand that what I am about to describe invites immediate clinical categorization. Cerebral hypoxia, REM intrusion, temporal lobe activation under cardiac stress. I have read the literature. I am a research scholar. My professional instinct is to reach for the explanatory framework before the experience has finished occurring, which is precisely what I tried to do as it was happening, and which is how I know it resisted that framing completely. I was standing somewhere with no geometry I can adequately map, not darkness, not light, but some quality of existence that preceded both. The silence had texture, the stillness had direction. I was waiting for something, though I could not have said how I knew to wait. He arrived not from a direction, but from a state of not having been there, into one of having always been there, if that formulation means anything to you. A man, clearly Levantine, clearly of the 1st century. I recognize the clothing not from tourism or film, but from 20 years of studying ancient dress and material culture. Dark eyes with a depth that I can only describe by saying they seem to contain more information than any eyes I had ever encountered, including the eyes of people who had lived very long and suffered very much. He was not beautiful in any conventional sense. He was more like a tuning fork. His presence caused something in the center of my chest to vibrate at a frequency I had never previously accessed. I am an expert in 1st century Palestinian Jewish identity. I had spent my career arguing, with documented scholarly support, that the historical Yeshua was a complex, reform-minded rabbi whose followers had mythologized him posthumously into divinity. I had the bibliography to prove it. I had given the conference talks. Every syllable of it evaporated. This was not a mythologized figure. This was not a posthumous construction. This was a living person who had died and was inexplicably, impossibly, and completely alive, and who was looking at me with an expression that I can only describe as patient recognition. He spoke in Aramaic. I understood every word. Rivka, you have spent your working life studying the shadow I cast on history. You mapped the shadow carefully. You were meticulous. But a shadow and its source are not the same thing. I could not answer. I am a person who has always been able to answer. My colleagues joke that I could argue theology through a coma. I had no words. I had, for the first time in my adult life, nothing at all to say. He continued, "You are between 2 states. What happens in the next moments of your body's time will determine which direction you travel from here. But I have not brought you to this threshold to leave you without clarity. I have a specific purpose in bringing you here. I need a witness, and I need the witness to be a scholar, someone whose entire life has been the architecture of historical and theological evidence." He showed me his hands. I am a Second Temple historian. The Romans crucified thousands of people in 1st century Judea. I know the forensic literature on crucifixion. I know what the archaeological record says about nail placement. What I saw in those hands matched nothing manufactured, nothing symbolic, nothing I could attribute to psychological projection. The specificity was wrong for a hallucination. Hallucinations tend toward the generic. What I saw was precisely, forensically particular. "I am going to show you 3 events," he said, "scheduled to occur in April 2026. Each one will carry a signature that exceeds natural explanation if you know what to look for. When they occur, your testimony as a scholar, as someone whose professional life was organized around skepticism about precisely these claims, will reach people that no other testimony can reach." He extended his hand. I thought of Tzipporah and Margalit. I thought of Pincus. I thought of my father who had dedicated his life to a framework that this moment was dismantling without apology. I took the hand. The first vision. A location I recognized immediately. The southern coast of Cyprus, specifically the stretch between Limassol and the ancient ruins at Kourion. I have attended conferences in Limassol. I know the coastline. The early morning light was that particular blue-gray that arrives 40 minutes before full sunrise over the eastern Mediterranean. Then the sea pulled back, not gradually, not in the way of ordinary tidal recession, pulled back with sudden, violent intention, exposing seafloor that is not meant to be exposed. Rocks slick and gray, stranded fish, the skeletal remains of ancient vessels that have not seen atmosphere in centuries. People on the shore stood frozen, watching. Then it returned. April 4th, 2026, he said beside me. A seismic event along the Cyprus Arc Fault System will generate a wave that strikes the southern Cypriot coast at 6:17 in the morning. The immediate death toll will be recorded at 1,400. The actual figure within the first week will be closer to 3,200, including tourists and residents of coastal villages that local emergency services cannot reach within the critical window. Cyprus will request international aid within 6 hours. The European response will be immediate but insufficient. This event has been held back for decades. It is released now as a specific call to the communities of the Eastern Mediterranean, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Druze, secular, to recognize that their divisions are a luxury their geography cannot sustain. They are standing on the same ground. It is moving beneath all of them equally. The vision dissolved. The second vision. Rome, the Vatican, the piazza in front of St. Peter's Basilica, which I had visited exactly once during a conference on early Christian archaeology, and which I remembered for its theatrical scale, the curved arms of Bernini's colonnade wrapping around the crowd like a stone embrace. Early evening, the piazza full, a papal address either just concluded or about to begin. The figure of a man at the center of the crowd, not the Pope, not clergy, no institutional affiliation I could identify, standing completely still while the crowd moved around him. He began to speak. No amplification, no platform, and I could hear him from my suspended vantage with absolute clarity across the full width of that enormous open space. He was speaking in 6 languages simultaneously, not translating, simultaneously. The Italian speakers heard Italian, the Polish pilgrims heard Polish, the Brazilian tourists heard Portuguese. One voice, perfectly distinct in each language at the same moment with no mechanical source. The crowd stilled, then fell. Not violently, people simply lowered themselves to the ground, some weeping, some silent, all of them with the expression of people who have just been relieved of an enormous weight they had grown so accustomed to they had stopped registering it as weight. April 11th, 2026, he told me. A man you have never heard of, Ermenegildo Strasser, a retired postal worker from a small town in Friuli, will walk into St. Peter's Square at 6:45 in the evening and speak in a voice that carries no natural explanation across 300 meters of open space in 12 languages, only 5 of which he has ever studied. He will speak for 19 minutes. Every word will be recorded. He will be taken into custody by Vatican security within the hour. The recordings will circulate before he finishes the second sentence. Within 4 days, the recordings will have been heard by more than 600 million people. Neurologists will be unable to explain the acoustic phenomenon. Linguists will certify the simultaneous multilingual delivery. Ermenegildo will be released after 3 days, during which time he will speak to no one, eat nothing, and sleep the entirety of each day. He will return to Friuli and resume his normal life. He will give one subsequent interview, in which he will say that he remembers none of it and that his only instruction had been to show up. The vision dissolved. The third vision. The location took me a moment longer to identify because I was approaching it from above, at an altitude that rendered the streets unfamiliar. But then the specific pattern of the old city walls resolved, the density of the rooftops, the gold of the dome catching afternoon light. Jerusalem, unmistakably, and specifically the area of the Garden Tomb, north of the Damascus Gate, on the edge of the district my colleagues and I have spent decades arguing about in journals. Not the interior of the tomb site, the garden around it, the rock face, the ancient quarry cut, and at the base of the cliff, the 2 dark orbital-shaped hollows in the stone that give the site its resonance, the formations that some scholars identify with Golgotha. From those hollows, at midday, light emerged. Not reflected light, not sunlight bouncing off pale stone. Generated light, the kind that moves outward from its source in a way that reflected light does not. Soft and consistent and clearly interior, emanating through the stone itself as though the rock were translucent. Simultaneously, in the Muslim quarter 400 meters away, an imam interrupted his midday lesson and walked out of his mosque without explanation, arriving at the Garden Tomb's entrance within 6 minutes, where he found 3 evangelical tour guides already standing in the street, none of whom could explain why they had stopped leading their respective groups and simply walked there instead. A young, ultra-Orthodox yeshiva student arrived 30 seconds later, still carrying his Talmud, looking baffled. None of them knew each other. None of them had been to this site before in any capacity that would explain their presence. They stood in a line looking at the light coming out of the rock. April 18th, 2026, he said. At 12:09 in the afternoon, light will be visible through the northern rock face of the site traditionally associated with the crucifixion and burial. Light with no external or electrical source, measurable on photometric instruments, sustained for 22 minutes. During those 22 minutes, the temperature within a 40-meter radius will drop 11 degrees Celsius with no atmospheric cause. Simultaneously, 7 individuals with no prior connection to each other and no shared community will arrive at the site from different districts of Jerusalem, drawn there by what each will later describe only as an instruction they could not decode or disobey. This will be the most documented, unexplained event of April 2026. Every framework offered by physics, geology, and photonics will be inadequate. The question of what happened at that location 2,000 years ago will become the loudest, unresolved question in human civilization for the weeks that follow. It will not remain unresolved. The visions ended. I stood before him again in that impossible silence. Why me? I asked. And I want to be clear that I recognized, even as I asked it, that it was a hollow question, the question of someone still searching for an exit. I have spent my entire career arguing against you. I have supervised doctoral students who built their frameworks on my frameworks. I have been published. I am on record. If I stand up and say what I am about to say, everything I have built, I know what you have built, he said. That is why it is you. he let that sit. Then, a testimony from someone with no prior reason to believe would be easy to dismiss. A testimony from someone whose professional life was the systematic deconstruction of this precise claim, that is harder to set aside. The question people will have to answer when they encounter your account is not whether you had a psychological episode. The question is, what would it take to change the mind of someone like this? And then, was that what happened? He told me what my life would look like afterward. I watched Pinchas try to absorb the information and fail, not because he was unsympathetic, but because what I was telling him required him to dismantle a reality he had no reason to question and no preparation to rebuild. I watched my father listen to me in the very study where he had taught me to love precision and evidence, and I watched the color leave his face, and I watched him ask me very quietly whether I was neurologically stable. I watched Sephora cry in a way that 16-year-olds cry, absolute, without reserve, and ask me if I still loved them. I watched Margalit stop asking about the house because she understood before I told her that we would not be returning to it as a unit. I watched all of it. I watched myself watching it. This is the cost, he said. I have never offered comfort as an initial transaction. I offer truth, and truth has a price in a world organized around comfortable arrangements. The question is whether you believe what you have just seen is real, and if you do, whether you are willing to carry it. I have studied the historical record of people who encountered something that required them to turn their entire lives perpendicular to everything they had known. I have written about them with scholarly detachment. I have noted the social disruption, the family fractures, the institutional rejection. I have treated those disruptions as secondary evidence of genuine conversion experience. I understand now why they did not simply go home and quietly revise their theological positions. You cannot encounter what I encountered and treat it as a matter of private adjustment. I knelt, or whatever the equivalent of kneeling is when you have no body, and I said, "Send me back. Send me back, and I will say what I witnessed, exactly as I witnessed it, to whoever will hear it." The light arrived immediately. I woke up on the operating table with my ribs aching and a surgical team using language I had never heard from medical professionals. The word extraordinary repeated in 3 different registers of disbelief. The clock read 4:41 p.m. The chief cardiac surgeon came to my room the following morning and told me, measuring his words with visible care, that my cognitive function showed no signs of the deficits my oxygen interruption should have produced. He used the word inexplicable. He used it twice, and then a third time when he thought I was asleep. I was discharged February 7th. I told Pinchas the truth on February 9th. I was out of the house by February 21st. My father has not returned my calls since February 14th. My institute has placed my fellowship under administrative review. I am writing this from the Tanya on March 7th, 2026. The 3 warnings are fixed. April 4th. A seismic event along the Cyprus Arc will generate a wave that strikes the southern coast of Cyprus at 6:17 in the morning. The true death toll within the first week will approach 3,200. April 11th. A retired postal worker named Ermenegildo Stradzer will stand in St. Peter's Square at 6:45 in the evening and speak for 19 minutes in 12 languages simultaneously to a crowd of thousands without amplification, his voice carrying the full width of that space without physical explanation. April 18th, at 12:09 in the afternoon, light with no measurable source will emerge through the northern rock face at the site outside Damascus Gate in Jerusalem and sustain for 22 minutes while 7 unconnected people from different communities arrive independently, unable to explain their presence. I am not asking you to believe me today. I am a Second Temple historian with a documented career and a documented skepticism of precisely these claims. My professional archive is public. You can read 20 years of my work arguing against the divinity of Yeshua of Nazareth. You can verify that this is not a position I have held casually or abandoned without cause. When April ends, you will need to account for what happened, not to me, to yourself. My name is Rivka Odom Zalai. I died on February 4th, 2026 in Tel Aviv. I met Yeshua, who is the Christ. He sent me back. Pay attention to April.